Thank you, Zach, and tremendous worship already so far this morning. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another great service Sunday at Serve Midtown Church. My name is Baird. I am the minister here, and I'm really grateful for everybody. If you're a guest here, especially with us, whether in person or online, thank you. From myself and from all of us for just taking some time to come hang out and share a Sunday with us. We really do appreciate the opportunity. If you didn't get a blessing or a donut this morning, a blessing. I hope you get a blessing. If you didn't get a donut this morning, and I feel weird saying this from the pulpit, you might have missed the best thing that there is to offer. The donuts are delicious, so don't miss out on those. But this morning, as we dive into the message, I want you to think through a question first. As it pertains to your past, to things from your distant behind that you may not like or want to think about, things that you're ashamed of, that you don't want to talk about, that you'd rather other people not know. Are you more inclined to let those things continue to haunt you and have power over you in the present, or are you more inclined to try and use them as fuel to propel yourself and rise above and make a change despite the difference? This morning is actually Christ the King Sunday. This is the final Sunday of the church calendar year. It's the first Sunday, or the last Sunday prior to Advent. And this is one of the newer celebrations to the church calendar. It was established after World War I by Pope Pius XI, who stated that he essentially hoped all its participants would always remember, whether human or nation, that if you did not rule in the reign of God, there would be no chance of everlasting peace. It's fitting that this Sunday falls right before the first Sunday of Advent, where we celebrate the first and second coming of Jesus Christ. If you want to mark your Bibles this morning, we're going to be in the Old Testament. The 23rd chapter of 2 Samuel is where we're going to be looking for a few minutes. And for context's sake, what we're diving in on is the end of David's life. David, the little shepherd boy who slayed Goliath and then rose to be king of Israel and nations and having triumphs, knowing all the psalms that we attribute to him. This same David is nearing the end of his life. And there's a lot of intrigue around the palace. What's going to happen next? Who's he going to give it to? Who is taking over the throne, and what will that look like? In fact, David was prepared to make Solomon his successor, but his eldest surviving son, Adonijah, was making some plans to try and thwart this attempt and take the throne for himself. The family of David would have made like a really, really good modern-day crime family docuseries. Or even just like an episode of Springer. They are really, there's a lot of craziness going on behind the scenes with them. And when we read today's passage, it can be characterized with the phrase, already, but not yet. We can see ways where God's reign has broken into our world, while also being fully aware of places where Christ's vision of the world is not fully present yet. We get a comparison in this passage between a ruler who's called just and at the end, the godless. So if you want to follow along with me in the book of 2 Samuel, starting in verse 1. I love hearing that, by the way. That's so fantastic. I was literally singing Father Abraham on my way to church this morning. It's amazing. I wish I were kidding. Verse 1 of 2 Samuel chapter 23. And these are the last words of David. Thus spoke David, son of Jesse. Thus spoke the man raised on high, anointed of the God of Jacob, and sweet singer of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord speaks through me. His word is upon my tongue. The God of Israel has spoken. The Rock of Israel has said to me, one who rules over people justly, ruling in the fear of God, is like the light of a morning, like sun rising on a cloudless morning, gleaming from the rain on the grassy land. Is not my house like this with God? For he has made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure. Will he not cause to prosper all my help and my desire? But the godless are all like thorns that are thrown away. For they cannot be picked up with the hand. To touch them, one uses an iron bar or the shaft of a spear, and they are entirely consumed in fire on the spot. This is a loaded passage. A lot to unpack here. In the prior chapter, chapter 22, David had written a victory psalm, talking about all the things God had done for him, all the ways he'd triumphed. Now this is followed by a second poem, which is very different in nature, not similar to a lot of the singing styles they would have had then, and kind of obscure in its meaning. In fact, the title, These Are the Last Words of David, we need to be careful how we view this because it's not literally his last words. We actually even know he has a deathbed testament that he gives to Solomon a little later on. So when we read the last words of David, it's not so much to be read as David the king who is dying, but rather the last pronouncement, the last work of art from David the royal poet. Think your favorite musician or artist creating what they knew would be their final piece, their swan song. That's more what we're getting here from David. Even as death approaches, he reminds us that we're called to honor God and try to edify people around us with our words and with our actions and living out the blessings that God has given us. These last words are often attributed as like really important. We know that we had the last words of Jacob and Moses, and here called of David, and they're kind of designed so that the people, the generations that would come after them, would have a model to look at. But regardless of what kind of last words these are, they provide complex ideas on the following three things: the relationship between the divine authority and human nature, the nature of the Davidic Covenant, and the persistent threat of human evil in the world. It starts with repeated attempts to identify David, who, if you've read the book of 2 Samuel, the entire book is about David. So you would think at this point there's no need to identify who it is, but it turns out that this reintroduction is actually necessary because it helps us to recast David. Yes, he is the king sitting upon the throne, but this isn't where he's writing from. This is David, the royal poet. David's known to be an oracle. In prophetic literature, the oracle was pretty much always ascribed to God, and so David isn't just king over people, but he's also operating as prophetic figure. David not only speaks for God, but in this matter, he also speaks as God would speak. He is going through this repetition. The son of Jesse, the man raised on high, anointed of the God of Jacob. He even calls himself the sweet singer of Israel. Maybe your version says the sweet psalmist, or maybe it has a different wording. In fact, the actual meaning of the Hebrew in this passage is still a little unclear. The closest word for word translation is like the sweet one or the favorite one of the chants and the songs of Israel. Regardless, though, we know whether musician, poet, or an artist of the two, David is renowned for what he does within this group of people. And the repeated attempts to identify who it is kind of helps us to know that what follows is important and maybe even controversial. A just ruler is what is talked about. David takes the traditional wisdom of some other people to talk about what is an ideal ruler, somebody who embodies all the virtues of Israel. The anointed king the just ruler is called to be just to both the people over whom they rule, helping them to have their rights and their properties, but also to rule over, or to help rule between the people over whom they rule, settling disputes among them, making sure that people weren't taking advantage of one another. And so they had to be just in multiple ways, and this passage talks about just, fearing, and serving in the fear of God. It actually compares this anointed king to brilliant rising sun on a cloudless morning. Light is sweet and bright and pleasant. And a just leader is illustrious and beneficial to those over whom they rule. The poet even adds that the light, the sun's radiance combined with the rainfall, grass springs forth from the earth. The rule of the just is a source of blessed fruitfulness for all they serve. Consider this. We should consider, rather, what hopes we have within our human institutions, our leaderships, our systems, and knowing full well they're run by humans. Human endeavors often fall short. David is one of these examples as well. But we should not give up to aspiring to something more than the status quo. Nor should we give into the temptation of believing the only place we can experience God is in the afterlife in heaven. Our call is to follow the lead of Jesus Christ through the fragile structures of which we are a part, and try and bring about a world more resembling that of God's vision. David then follows with a bold claim that he and his descendants are and shall be the just and pious rulers described in this passage. If you know stuff about David's life, this might be a tough pill to swallow, because David's family was not so with God as is described in this passage. They had not been so while he was alive. He could tell that they were not going to be so when he was gone. His house would neither be as pious or as prosperous as you might expect. The covenant before God that David gets, given in 2 Samuel chapter 7, promises him from God the Master to David the servant. He promises him unilaterally that there will be eternal kingship through his offspring. This is what's known as the Davidic Covenant. This is not the same as the covenant made with Abraham, but it is a continuation of it. So if you're to flip over to the book of Matthew, this is why it starts off in chapter 1 with an entire lineage of Abraham, all the way to David, all the way down to Jesus. David frames the statement about the eternal covenant with rhetorical questions. Is not my house like this with God? Will not he cause my things to prosper? The implied answer to this is yes. But the possibility that the answer could be no should caution us from taking God's grace for granted. In fact, biblical history details well the failures of David and his household. And in Psalm 89, David himself actually even acknowledges the possibility of God withdrawing his divine protection. It's not a given that David's house will always be like this, and God's grace isn't to be taken for granted. But as this claim goes, it pertains to Christ. We should read this as a prophecy. It came nearly 1,000 years prior to Jesus' birth, that a ruler among men, over men, who rules justly in the fear of the Lord, according to the will of the Father and according to the traditions that exist, that this type of leader shall be like brilliant light cloudless morning. For he is the light of the world. Or like the rainfall that comes from the sky, for he offers us living water. Or he is the grass for the earth, for he is the vine and the fruit that it bears. This passage provides a vision of wholeness that includes a leader who did rule justly for all people. Maybe just one, but there wasn't. So our tension becomes, how do we try to live out this vision while also acknowledging the brokenness that we see all around us? It's hard. In the book called Saving Paradise, the authors Rita Brock and Rebecca Parker talk about Jesus' call for us to engage in a world that is dangerous amid the allures of the empire, and they highlight two temptations in which we are especially vulnerable. The first one is a temptation to bring about a paradise on earth through political change. The answer to our problems is this change in structure, this change in policy, this change in leadership, dynamic, fill in the blank. There's a lot of dangers in that temptation. And the other temptation, equally to be aware of, is the temptation to flee. Just run from everything and get away from all the institutions of the world entirely. Apocalyptic movements that claim the end is near fall into this second temptation. And people often read biblical texts in an apocalyptic way because their experiences have taught them to give up on human institutions. They believe that all structures will come to a violent end, and that the only place to experience God is either in the afterlife or in an otherworldly venture. But we know that it's available right now and to be experienced and lived into in the moment. Recent work on apocalyptic thinking and psychology surrounding it helps us kind of pinpoint that what drives these people to this place is that when people feel like there is no reason to engage in the world, they often live in ways that are at best unhelpful, and at worst downright destructive. We desperately need reminders of what it was like to live out God's vision, bearing witness to Him in a compassionate way and in a just way to the people around us, while also not overlooking the description of the godless, which the fate of is a double-edged sword in this regard. On the one hand, it says the godless are all like thorns that are thrown away, while the ruler, who's just, is compared to light and radiant brilliance on a sunny morning in luscious fields of grass. The antithesis of green soft grass is a prickly thorn, torn from its roots. A thorn at the mere touching of which leaves one in need of healing and replenishing. And the end result of these thorns is they're going to be gathered, not with hand, but by a tool, piled up and burned, scorched from existence, to rid us of the threat. As the church, we're engaged in the ongoing work of God. And we're reminded that God has always chosen to use flawed and vulnerable people and institutions to bring about the change that He calls us to live into. God's far greater than our human institutions, and our hope doesn't rest on our ability to make change in and of ourselves. So when we see brokenness, when we see these things in the world, we shouldn't lose hope and run from working toward the reign of God, but rather just be reminded that the work of God is, as we talked about in the beginning, an already, but not yet, type of process. As David reminds us, one who rules over people justly is like light of the morning, gleaming grass on the land. when we work in partnership with God for justice and the well-being of the world, people are able to flourish. We've seen examples of this type of life. Dorothy Day, Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, people who have made significant change in their work for justice on both international and national levels. And their work is something to be admired and aspired towards, but also remembering our work probably won't take place on a national or international level, but it absolutely will take place locally right where you're at. We've seen it at work. In fact, we've all been a part of it. We know that the work can sometimes be tough, tireless, frustrating. Not every story has a happy ending. But our job is to show up and continue making an impact in the lives of those whom we encounter. Last week we gathered here, not to do a service like this, but instead to try and go be the hands and feet for a little bit. We created upwards of 80, somewhere close to 100 welcome packages that we put together and assembled as a group, and then took and hand-delivered out to the neighborhood, to the houses and the residents around the area, because we're the new kids on the block. We're just here a couple of months, but we want to get to know our neighbors. We want to be in our community. And doing this type of work is very much what it means to work into the already, but not yet, work of Christ our King. Our final thought for today is from a book called Forgotten Among the Lilies by Ronald Rolheiser, and he writes this: if the church that I was raised in had a fault, and it did, it was precisely that it did not allow for mistakes. There was supposed to be no need for a second chance. It demanded that you get it right the very first time. If you made a mistake, you lived with it. And you were doomed to be sad, at least for the rest of your life. A serious mistake was a permanent stigmatization, a mark that you wore like Cain. I've seen that mark on all kinds of people. Divorcees, ex-priests, ex-religious, people who have had abortions, married people who have had affairs, people who have had children outside of marriage, parents who have made serious mistakes with their children, and countless other serious mistakes as well. There's too little around to help you. We need a theology of brokenness. We need a theology that teaches us that even though we cannot unscramble an egg, God's grace lets us live happily and with renewed innocence, far beyond any egg we may have scrambled. We need a theology that teaches us that God does not just give us one chance, but that every time we close a door, He opens another one for us. Father God, we thank you, the opener of doors, the creator of life and the light of the world. We are so grateful that you give us chances, one after the other, as we continue to miss the mark. As scrambling eggs is our status quo sometimes, Lord. If there's truth we have today, help us to move forward, listening with your Spirit and finding how we can live into your reign in a world where there is brokenness all around us. We love you, Father, and we ask these things in the holy name of Jesus. Amen.